think that it's important that the parties have the type of relationship in a partnership where they can talk about things, and even if it's time, reach a resolution.
Welcome to Investment Grade Practices Podcast, where we believe private practice dentists deserve to get the lifestyle today while building an asset for tomorrow. Join your host, Victoria Peterson, to design the practice of your dreams and secure your financial independence. Let's get started.
Reagan Robertson here, president of Productive Dentist Academy and host of Everyday Practices. Before we get started, I want to let you know this week only, we are offering our once a year chance at getting 12 months of PDA for free. That's right. Register for a 2022 productivity workshop and you will receive 12 months of PDA on demand and a 2-hour one-on-one business advisory session with us. Not only does this save you over $3,000, but doctors that attend and use PDA on demand report doubling productivity in mere months. You can get yours this week if you sign up before December 3rd. Go to www.productivedentist.com/Cyber Monday to access, or call us directly at 1-800-757-6077. Now let's get productive.
I love that. Well, I added equipment leases to the assignability, and you're right. I remember a partnership. We had like a 3-year, complete the buyout of the partnership, and everything's on track, everything's set, value set, everything's done. And then the selling partner, obligated the company to $150,000 worth of new technology and training. And the younger partner was like, dude, what am I going to do with that a year and a half from now? Now I have to go and learn that procedure. I don't think I want to do that.
Right. Yeah, it comes up far more often than you would think. I mean, I've probably had 3 or 4 of those in the last year that's happened. And granted, the others I don't think were like a week before the deal like this one I'm referencing, but they might have only made one payment to that point on their contract.
Sure.
And now they're stuck, and like whoever the buyer is, particularly with the DSO, which DSOs are very particular, they may not want it. And then what are you supposed to do at that point?
Yeah. Hey, can we jump into...
And really, typically, there isn't a lot of success in getting them to pay for something they don't want.
Absolutely. Let's move into partnerships if we can. I know over the years you have crafted so many associate to partial ownership, 50-50, then final takeover, or a partnership model where it grows much like a law firm where you have the senior partner and then the junior partners come in and maybe you have 5 or 6 doctors. And what are some of the pros and cons and pitfalls of that? I know that's a big question. Or let me start with an easier question. Let me start with an easier question while you're thinking of the pros and cons. Once you put a contract in place, a partnership contract in place, how frequently should you review it?
I think that once a partnership agreement is put in place, you should review it 100% of the time with an attorney.
And on a day-to-day basis, you mentioned like there's the getting into it, and then there's the how you operate from it. Do you have that agreement there as you're going through maybe your annual planning or quarterly, or when you're having decision-making conversations? How do you use your partnership agreement as an operating tool?
The best, this might shock some of the I guess it wouldn't be listeners or viewers, I guess it'd be the readers. It may shock some readers, but the best contract, the best partnership, the best partnerships are those where you sign the contract and you never pick it up again. That doesn't mean that you don't need a contract, because unfortunately, many times you do have to pick it up again. And so I think that, and what I mean by the best partnerships are where you don't have to pick the contract up again, is that because all the partners have so much trust and are on the same page so much that they feel that they can work anything out without having to run to a contract and sort of, hinge on their legal rights in that situation. The issue is that when you get multiple parties together, particularly some that are very successful and like things to be done their way, disagreements often arise and can't be resolved. And therefore, the doctors do have to go back to the contract and they have to review it and see what their rights are. And the more partners that are involved, you mentioned, the six-partner partnership, the more partners are involved, the more voices need to be heard and the more issues that could arise with that, because now you're asking multiple parties to agree. I guess what I would say is the more people that have to agree to something, the harder it's going to be, right? And so I think that it's important to have a really well-written contract that you can refer to if you need to, but that if issues arise, you're typically able to handle them by having conversations and trust and working things out reasonably. But as far as getting through the deal and getting out of the deal, the main items with respect to getting through the deal that need to be outlined in the partnership agreement are how the money is split and how the costs are split. That would be one kind of together. And the second is how management decisions are being made. And that kind of touches back on the point I just talked about, where the more people involved and the more decisions that need to be made, the more difficult things can be. So, for instance, in how management decisions are being made, you're much more likely to reach resolution and decision on something if you base your decision making based on a majority consent. If you've got 5, 6, 7 partners, you would a unanimous consent where every single person has to agree in order for something to happen. And so that operating through the deal, I think, is two main items in operating through. And then getting out of the deal is death, retirement, disability, default, and disagreement. So there's really 5 things that need to be covered in getting out of a partnership deal. Again, death, retirement, disability, disagreement, and default on the contract. And the reality is there's really only one of those that people wish happens, and that's retirement. But everything goes well, they're ready to be done practicing, and they want to retire from the practice. Certainly nobody wants to have disability or disagreement or to have faulted on contract. So in terms of picking the agreement back up again and why you would need to do that, well, you could very well need to be doing that pretty quickly if the way out is those 4 things I just said are the ways out that people don't typically want. So hopefully that answers your questions, but I'm happy to speak more specifically.
I love all of this. When you went into as an operating agreement, you pointed out the 2 things that you've taught me well. How's the money split? What's the formulary for that so that it drives the actions of the CPA firm? And then how are management decisions made? How do you make it if you're 50-50 partners and you're stalemated? What are some things that you could educate yourself towards as strategies for ending stalemates in a 50-50 partnership?
That's an awesome question. I would say there's no perfect answer for a stalemate, but there are several different paths to resolve it, all of which can be helpful. And it could be that there could be multiple ways to reach resolution, and there's no one single right way necessarily. So the first thing that I would say is some partnership agreements that I've seen would say that the doctor who's been there longer gets to break the tie. And that's actually one of the most heavily negotiated points in the deal that I'm involved with right now, where I'm actually representing the buying party coming in that's being told that if there's a dispute, it's the doctor who's been there longer that gets to break the tie. I think that solution promotes significant unfairness in the deal and can adversely impact the way that the partnership is going to operate, because you've then got a 50-50 partner that's walking on eggshells and doesn't feel incentivized because their voice doesn't have to be heard. And I don't think that meets for a recipe for a successful partnership, because all voices should typically be heard. I think another way that I've seen resolution be made is an independent third party can help make a binding decision if the parties disagree. Now, depending on what the disagreement is based on, that obviously would decide which independent third party what type that would be, or if an independent third party would be even a valid solution in the current situation. But sometimes an independent third party that's objective can help the parties resolve a resolution. So if it's like a financial related decision, oftentimes maybe a third party independent accountant can come in and help the parties make a binding decision. But usually, again, I mean, if the parties are deadlocked, again, this is where you hope that the parties will not even have to have picked up the contract, because you want it, the parties, the best partnerships are those where if there is a deadlock, the parties can talk to each other about it and find a way to reach a resolution. You know, stick them in a room and let them figure it out, because the alternative is not good. And that's thousands of dollars in legal fees or hundreds of thousands of dollars in lawsuits. And that doesn't work for anybody. That's not, and usually in those lawsuits where the parties are spending that kind of money, nobody comes out of it better than they would if they just sat down in a room and came to an agreement. So, except that now they've got less money in their pocket. So I think that it's important that the parties have the type of relationship in a partnership where they can talk about things, and even at the toughest time, reach a resolution. But the default in a partnership would be that if both parties can't agree, then whatever was proposed does not happen. And that's where you have to really work out the magic of the dynamics of personalities and what the vision is of the partnership, and getting out in front from a contract drafting standpoint for whichever side you're on to anticipate issues that may arise later on. Now, more specifically, an example of that would be, let's say you've got a partner that's going to retire in 2 years and a partner that is going to work for 20 more years. The partner that works for 20 more years wants to get a new piece of equipment, a new machine, because it's going to significantly increase the value of the practice. The partner who's retiring in 2 years doesn't want the partnership to take on that debt, because they're not going to really benefit from the fruits of that machine and from all its benefits in such a short period of time. And then obviously now they're taking on more debt for an asset that's going to depreciate. So at that point, if the parties can't come to an agreement as to whether or not to get the machine, the default would be, well, we can't get the machine because we both don't agree on getting the machine. If it's unanimous consent, there's no sort of tiebreaker, so to speak. So I think it's really important from a drafting standpoint, as you're going in and you see, a doctor going to retire on the other side, to be able to draft language in that situation that gets out in front of it, that talks about the establishment of purchasing new equipment, that finds resolutions of, hey, let's sit in a room. Maybe I, as the doctor that's going to be here for 20 years, owns that machine, and I take on that debt, and you don't. But I own that machine. That value is mine. And the production that comes from that machine is mine, and I'll lease it back to the practice for a fee, right? I mean, there's different ways that you can handle it if you just get in a room with your team, your advisors, and talk about it. But I guess to answer your question more bluntly, I don't really think there's a perfect tie-breaking solution. I think there's the solution where you can have one partner have like the super majority where they get to break the tie, which I don't think ever ends well. Or you can have an independent third party, which I think is a really liberal, nice way to do things, but it's not always the solution in every type of situation. Like an independent third party is probably not going to be able to help make a binding decision on whether a piece of equipment gets purchased or not. That's really a business decision. That's not really anything other than that. And so if the doctors typically need to get in a room and work it out, because again, the alternative is lawsuits and a lot of legal fees, and the attorneys win in that sense. And that's kind of like what everyone says about attorneys, is only the attorney ever wins. That's a long answer, but hopefully that helps.
I learned something fabulous from you once again. I love the idea of having, like maybe you just work this out in your MOU, your mutual understanding, up front. And it could be in the contract that says, when it comes to purchase of equipment above certain amount, if there's no agreement, then we must fill out this usage utilization form. Like I had one of those at Neighborhood Smile, so they could buy anything they wanted. However, they needed to show me the ROI first. So there was a way of proving that you needed it. And then bring in maybe your CPA to say, yes, if you bought it and you depreciated it, blah, 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 blah. You could make that work. So I love the concept of bringing in the professionals. Yeah, I love all of that. I want to speak to this other piece of, like, you and I went through a deal recently where the exit clause for retirement came into question. And one doctor read it as you're retiring, you get your retirement. The other one read it as I'm ready to sell you the other half. Now, I know that's not a typical scenario. However, that's what I mean by how often should I look at it if I have an agreement and, I stick it in a drawer and 20 years later I open it up and go, surprise, that doesn't say what I thought it was going to say. So is there like an annual attorney review or something like that would be helpful in longer term partnerships?
Yeah, I think that the basis of that really, and what attorneys don't often do very well, is really the foundation is to draft a contract that's worded in a way that's appropriate legally, but also is clearly understandable to a dentist whose profession is to do dentistry and not to be a lawyer. And so I think that it's really important to draft contracts that the dentist can actually understand. And I found that is far more important to do than drafting contracts that are very difficult and nobody can understand. And so I think that if your teammate is a lawyer and you hire a lawyer to draft the contract, you as a doctor, you really want to hire a lawyer that's going to help you draft the contract that you can easily understand. And I think that if the contract is easily understandable, a lot of the concepts, including the retirement clause, for instance, as you just mentioned, stick a little more in the mind without having to do your annual reviews or your quarterly reviews or whatever they are. And it's not that those reviews are bad, but sometimes they cost some money and et cetera. But I think that really the contract should be understandable enough to the extent that it's either a quick look or you remember off the top of your head. Now, of course, not every doctor is going to remember everything off the top of their head. So it's always, I think, a good idea to sit down. I would say yearly is probably a good time period. I think quarterly may be too quick. I think yearly is a good time period to sit down and just evaluate the contract and not understand there, but to evaluate it and see what's working and what's not working. And like you mentioned, if you're in a situation of your interest to retire to go based on the tangible asset, well, that might be okay for if you sell months later, but first of all, it's probably never okay, but you're going to be in a lot better shape 6 months later than you do 20 years later. Yeah. And there's no factored in, and you haven't looked at it for 20 years that was in there. I think that if that was year one, and the parties go, it's not this, then I think both parties would be on board to adjust that because it's in the best interest for everybody. You get 20 years down the road and you're about to retire, well, if there's something not on side favor, at that point, the cat's out of the bag. They know he's retiring, and they're going to do an agreement. So I think that it's important to do this, not just from understanding, but also just to see if there's anything that's working or not working that needs to be changed.
I love that you put it in that frame. It's been my experience in business that it really isn't about right or wrong, mine or yours. Like if you're in that kind of contract and that type of relationship, you're in the wrong relationship to begin with. So I love that you bring fresh eyes to the legal perspective that, number one, it's about relationships and having a shared vision. With that in place, the contract really is only there as a supportive agreement. And I love this element that you brought in about an annual review of it simply as a housekeeping mechanism. so that you could just avoid a lot of pain down the road. And whether you agree or don't agree, with what's in the contract, and if you don't look at it year to year, then you're stuck with it. And then you spend a lot of money on attorneys. Oh, I loved also that you said it must be written in plain English that people can understand. I have so appreciated that about you, that all the contracts you write, they're in plain English. I can explain them. And you never let me sign anything that's not in plain English.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I do a lecture that's literally called Legalese in Plain English. So I'm a firm believer of that.
So is there anything from Legalese in plain English that we haven't covered?
Well, I think there's one thing in particular that I do want to bring up, and I think that it should have probably gone at the beginning when you said, what is the key thing that dentists need to know about contracts, right? So I kind of went into the foundations of what the true legal elements of a contract are. But I think there's a component to it that, if I could say this, it's maybe the most important thing I say in this interview, and I think it'd be extraordinarily helpful for doctors, is the negotiation element of a contract. And I can't say this enough. Negotiation is not about winning and losing. And it's not a sports game. Negotiation is about getting more of what you want without the other side being below the status quo. Negotiation is about growing the pie and not taking more of the pie. And I think that gets lost all of the time. And lawyers are the biggest culprit of that. I mean, lawyers all the time lose sight of that. And lawyers are competitive, and lawyers like to win and feel like they got to win. And a lot of doctors feel that way too. And that's not a true solution. So it's about getting more of what you want, the other side being below the status quo. I don't really like calling it a win-win. I like calling it getting more of what you want and growing the pie. There's more room of the pie. So I think that if there's anything I say, I think that is critically important. And it helps doctors sort of focus more in on resolving and solutions than just trying to win. And what trying to win does is ruin deals, ruin relationships, and lose opportunities. And I know that sounds really strange, but I think that the focus on one winner, one loser will result in that, particularly in the dental industry, which is a very close-knit community, and it's very relationship-driven.
Wow. I stand in awe of you. Really, you get it. And I tell people all the time when I refer them to you that you literally broke the mold on what you might preconceive as an attorney and what their role is. That you are a real human being that understands true human dynamics and always working towards the greater good of both parties. I see in my own negotiations. If I get to hey, let me go for it. You're like, really? What's going to get you? You pull back both buyer and seller into what is good for you, what allows them to maintain their position and move both forward. I just love that. Thank you for explaining that as a strategy.
Yeah, I'm happy. I'm really happy it's helpful, and I think that I think that's really important to focus on that. You know, I mean, and it's hard all the time to do that. You know, like before we got on the phone, I was talking to another client that is really given in a little, and they feel like, and the seller working, this is a buyer, and the seller working back for them really wants to be given health insurance in the practice. And my client, the buyer, really is not wanting to do that because they feel like they've kind of bent over backwards in all these different ways to make this work. And so, and they feel like they're sort of like losing if they give in and allow the doctor to have the health insurance. And I really had to explain, well, no, you're not losing. You're actually growing the pie because health insurance is cheap and nothing in comparison to the goodwill that you're going to get from keeping that doctor happy, working back for you. They're going to want to bend over backwards to help you because you've given them more of what they want. And now you get more of what you want, which is a big picture of making way more money than you would make off of not paying a doctor's health insurance. So that's kind of like an example of like what I was just talking about. But I think it happens all the time.
Man, I love it so much. David, thank you. If our listeners and readers want to learn more about you and the services you provide, where would I send them?
So my website is www.cohenlawfirm.com, and that's COHEN for the Cohen part. And my email is david@cohenlawfirm.com. And I'm also one of the very few people to do this, and I find, but I have no problem giving my cell phone number out. People don't typically abuse it, and I'm happy to always be a resource. And my cell phone number is 206-919-9060, and that's the best ways to get a hold of me.
I think you also now have a Facebook group. What is that called?
That's a great point. I have a Facebook group called Practice Transitions Revolution, and it's really intended to revolutionize transitions and get people talking openly about them in a safe forum. So it's called the Practice Transitions Revolution. It's a Facebook group, and we've had a pretty good group. It's a young group. I mean, young in terms of it hasn't. I just started it not too long ago.
Yeah,
and it's starting to pick up some traction, and I'm kind of excited about it that people can express themselves there.
Well, I'm a big fan. Thank you so much for your time today, David. I will get you a transcript and edits for the book.
Yeah, again, I'm just honored to be a part of it. Really appreciate it, and I'm excited for you. I think you have so much to offer and so much to give, and I think a book like that is going to be major as far as that's concerned.
Aw, thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Investment Grade Practices Podcast. If you find value in this episode, help us spread the word by passing it along to a dental friend, subscribe, and give us a like on iTunes or Spotify. Learn more about building your investment grade practice at productivedentist.com today.